Was that strategic? You're like, write a book about left and right and red and blue in 2024. Right?
It was. I mean, the idea for the book came about 2 years ago. It was a little while back, and kind of forecasting, looking ahead and kind of going, okay, 2020, 2016, the last two election seasons.
Well, that was easy.
Gnarly, crazy, and dude, and looking at some things that we learned, some mistakes we made, some things that went well, and trying to forecast and look ahead and kind of go, hey, is there anything here that might be a resource for other churches, other leaders trying to process through how do we navigate well the next election season?
Welcome to Jesus in the Upper Left, where we're talking about gospel multiplication in the Pacific Northwest. Hey, welcome back to Jesus in the Upper Left, and we got a really fun episode today. I'm Gabe Kolstad, and I'm from Westside Community Church, and Joshua Hawthorne is here. How you doing, Joshua?
What's up, Gabe?
Good to see you from Brilliance Labs, if you didn't already know that. And we have Josh Butler with us, which we're so excited about.
What a treat.
Thanks, Josh is the author of The Party Crasher and other books, and also new again in town, right?
Yes.
Yeah,
back.
Yeah.
The reprise.
Yeah, absolutely. So tell us a little about your history in Portland and what you're doing now.
Totally. So from Willamette Valley, grew up in Kaiser, went to University of Oregon, Eugene, and then was here in Portland, was a pastor for over 15 years, in Portland about 18 years. Was pastoring at a church here in Portland, loved it, was great. And then was kind of local and global outreach focused, and also led worship a bit. And then went to Arizona last 5 years and was a lead pastor out there. Great season, love the church out there. But then have recently now found ourselves back home, wanting to be back near kind of extended family, longtime friends out here, and it's been good to be home, back in the Northwest, and feels like home and family, and even just the family of churches here in the Pacific Northwest. It's good to be back.
That is amazing. And before we get too far into this, I just want to ask a little bit about your hair.
Yeah.
Because, I just feel like so jealous at this moment right now.
It's a mess.
How do you get that volume? That's what everybody wants to know.
Well, I stuck my finger in the socket as a kid and just never went back. No, it was so funny this week. I just put a picture up online about this week. My daughter, I walked out. There was like a dress like your parent or teacher day at her school I didn't know about. So I walked out and my daughter had this big old wig she had gotten and like glasses and her coffee mug and was wearing my jacket.
Twins.
I had to do a double take. Like, what? Like, I was dying laughing for like a couple days since then. Yeah,
that's
so
awesome.
Good. But yes.
Oh man, my daughter goes to that same school, and so she dressed up like me.
Oh, no way!
She had my Bitcoin Portland Bit Devs hoodie and like swimming in this thing, and my big these shorts and like
That's awesome.
It's fun.
It's so good, like father, like daughter. Yeah.
Absolutely.
The apple does not fall far from the tree.
Yeah. So here's my first question for you, Josh.
Yeah.
Are you a sucker for pain?
Yes.
Like, is that you just have a certain like death warrant that you're like if it's hard, hard and controversial, that's the hill I'm gonna fight for. Is that?
It's true. I assume you're referring. I've written a couple of books on some controversial topics. So the first one was on like hell, judgment, holy war, the skeletons of God's closet, kind of tough questions that people wrestle with. Second one got into like sacrifice, wrath, atonement, things like that. The next one is sexuality, and this one on politics. And honestly, it's
all well received, right?
Yeah. So, somewhat, but like, but I would say the drive. There's not like some shock jock desire to be controversial, or whatever. But just over the years as a pastor, finding, man, these are the topics and questions I've really wrestled with. Going, man, how do we shepherd through this? And I get bored without a challenge, and so going, man, how do we do this well? And I get excited to kind of go, I want to dive into this and try and think through this and reflect and prayerfully reflect, dig into church tradition and history and read and process, man, how do we think well about this and lead well in this and even shepherd well and live well ultimately, like in faithfulness to Christ in these areas. So I'd say it's definitely not like a controversy for controversy's sake, but when it comes to which topics, but more of just, man, these are the questions I found myself asking. I have been in ministry now for a little over 20 years, and it's tended to be the topics and themes that I've found myself grappling with the most, and don't feel like I have all the answers, but generally want to try and be a part of the conversation and help catalyze conversation for how do we shepherd well and live well.
Yeah. As you talk about this, I'm reminded also of your article on deconstruction.
Oh yeah, totally. That got a little, a little fire.
You forgot to mention that one.
Totally.
but you, and I totally agree. Like I get no sense of like shock jock. I'm going to try to just get a rise out of everyone and say something controversial to get like clicks and reposts and outrage, right? Yeah. Because you actually deal with issues with nuance and thoughtfulness. They just happen to be the really important issues that people are really agitated over because they are core to our identity and are just emotionally very just like people are just sensitive to these kind of things. Like you're talking about this deconstruction process, and like you're looking at what causes deconstruction, and maybe it's not all you can blame it on your pastor.
Yes.
Right?
Totally.
Thank you. And people don't want to hear that.
Yeah. Totally.
So, but in related to this, I feel like in ministry, there's a pressure to play it safe. Right? Because you're going to get those emails on Monday morning. Yeah. If you hit too hard on something that is a bit of someone's idol or just a sensitive trigger point. And so what is it like? Where have you found this secret reserve of courage? Or like what is it that made you say, okay, Lord, I'm going to take this call. I'm going to step out and be willing to take some shots over the importance of an issue.
This is just kind of on the fly right now, like, because I don't know if I've ever talked about this publicly, but I have processed at times, sometimes like it feels like this balance or connection between like the priestly and the prophetic part of kind of church leadership ministry. And so when I think of the priestly, I do think there's this value where the priest, there was a stability, there was a structure that they were helping maintain for the people of God. When I think of the Old Testament, the priesthood, and no one is kind of going like, oh, that crazy priest, or whatever, like doing the wild stuff. You actually don't read much about their own kind of personality, their own opinions, or their own perspective. Like it's more like some biblical scholars would say they tend to play more of a role, almost like a play, a dramatic performance, where they're facilitating that role, representing God to his people and the people to God in kind of a liturgy, a drama of sorts that provided, and they're organizing the feasts and the festivals and they're bringing the word. And so they bring that stability and structure. But then when you look at the prophets, it's like, dude, they're crazy, man. They're like walking around naked for 40 days. They're like cooking their food over dung. They're like
crazy hair,
and they're disruptive. They're bringing this kind of backlash that's coming back of like, oh, don't say that. And I think at times, on the one hand, there's a health to like when there is something to, I think, as church leadership to providing that stability, those rhythms, the structure. And so I have to watch myself sometimes and kind of going like, okay, I don't want to just rock the boat, and sensitive to the Spirit when those things are needed. But I think there can be a danger at times if we can dismiss the disruptive of the prophetic, of kind of going like, hey, we don't want we're so concerned with stability, we don't want anyone to leave, and we can become almost like more prone to what do the Israelites grumbling in the wilderness want to hear, when God might be saying, hey, I'm actually calling you to lead in a different direction, and so I've got to wrestle with that balance. I think a lot of us as church leaders, we have to wrestle with that balance, because you do see some where, you see a tension there at times or a balance, I think, that needs to be held, and that there's different gifting perhaps within the body of Christ too. I know some leaders who are really great providing kind of that priestly leadership of organizational clarity and structure and stability. And then I think we also need leaders who can bring sometimes that disruptive voice and a calling to where God might be calling us to.
Yeah, and I think at least in the church, maybe this is historical too, but at least today, there's like the itinerant preacher, like speaker, well-known person that travels around and can have that like prophetic message, but then they can go home and they don't have to clean up the mess.
Yeah.
But I admire that about you, that you didn't just move into like this public speaking ministry and hey, I write books, and if you want me to come in and talk about the hard topics, you can pay me a bunch of money and I'll come in and do it, and then leave you the mess to clean up. But you've kept yourself tethered into the local church.
Yeah.
While speaking about those issues, and then testing out and like playing in the dirt of real human life over those issues.
Yes.
Where it's easy if you just have some speaking ministry, you can talk about the stuff up here and not actually have to apply it.
Yes.
So.
Totally. No, I remember years ago when my first book was coming out, I had a mentor and an elder at our church. He asked me, he's like, Josh, so ideal world, let's just say like you had the opportunity, whatever, the book did well. Would you rather do you see yourself more as like pastor author or author pastor, which comes first? And without even flinching, I was just like pastor author, because I seen a number of friends who I think went after kind of the author speaking, whatever circuit, and just uprooted from the local church, uprooted from the trenches of local ministry. And I'm not saying for everyone, but just generally speaking, when it came to, I think, even some of the desires and motives or things, like it just felt like an unhealthy trajectory and often led downstream to unhealthy. Now, I'm not saying that there's not a play. I know some others who have launched a nonprofit or a parachurch ministry, and that was God's calling and doing great stuff. But I think being rooted in and tethered to and underneath local leadership in a local community, knowing and being known.
Well, you guys ready to talk about politics?
Well, let's do it.
On this election year. This kind of timing, was that strategic? You're like, write a book about left and right and red and blue in 2024. Right?
It was. I mean, the idea for the book came about 2 years ago. It was a little while back, and kind of forecasting, looking ahead and kind of going, okay, 2020, 2016, the last two election seasons.
Well, that was easy.
Gnarly, crazy, and dude, and looking at some things that we learned, some mistakes we made, some things that went well, and trying to forecast and look ahead and kind of go, hey, is there anything here that might be a resource for other churches, other leaders trying to process through how do we navigate well the next election season ahead? And again, don't claim to have it all figured out on that front, but wanted to try and offer some reflections that I found helpful personally.
Yeah. So let's talk about your book a little bit. So the Party Crasher. Who would you say your audience is, and what's your primary message that you're wanting to get across, just as in a summary with that book?
Great, yeah. So I'd say the primary audience, those who are just like context is just going, okay, we all know, dude, we are as a society just more fractured than ever. The partisan divide, it's fracturing families, it's fracturing friendships, it's fracturing churches. And I think there's a silent majority who are frustrated with that. You have often the extremes. Even, some studies would say like it's the more extreme voices on 10% on one side, 10%ish on another side who are driving the conversation. But you have a silent majority of 80%ish, say, in the middle who are frustrated with the polarizing rhetoric and exchange. And so the audience is, I'd say, primarily for those of us who are there and are going, how do we stay united in a world that's coming apart? How do we stay at the table together when there are different ideologies that are pulling for our allegiance in ways that can pull us away from our deepest allegiance being to Christ and can fracture the body of Christ into partisan tribes, And so that's the heart of the book is really for the unity of the church, and not just sort of a plastic, superficial unity that kind of go, let's just focus on spiritual things and not talk about politics. Or let's just pretend like there's not an issue, but one that actually can name and address some of the elephants in the room or donkeys in the room or whatever, and name some of the tensions in the room, and yet also with humility and maturity and respect, keep us united to Jesus in the midst of it and one another.
Yeah. Awesome. Okay, so I read the book this last week, and one of the actually these are two different frameworks that I found super helpful to both understand myself and understand some of the dialogue going on today in the church and in politics. So you talk about this quadrant, right? About those that emphasize progress, responsibility, identity, or security. And then you also talk about the difference between your leaning and your bowing. Could you kind of just break that down and summarize that? Just because I think it's super helpful.
Definitely, yeah. Okay, so this is what I call the four political religions, and this came from Jim Mullins, my co-lead pastor in Arizona, and I. This is a lot as his genius, but in the last election season, he and I use these categories in our church to try and just help name some of the tensions we were feeling and all, right? And the basic idea is this, that we often think left and right, like a left and right political spectrum, which is true, but not recognizing that there's also a top-down axis, which would say like modernity on the top and post-modernity on the bottom end of that axis. And so if you can envision, for those who are listening, if you can envision in your head these 4 quadrants, you got your left-right axis of politically left and right, and you've got this top-down axis of modernity to post-modernity. And I'd say that top-down axis helps explain why the traditional sort of political divide feels split. Like some of the deepest fighting we see today is not just between left versus right, but different camps on the left and different camps on the right. And so if we kind of walk through, we call the 4 quadrants in that grid, right? So if we start with the modern left, so kind of the upper left quadrant, and I call this the religion of progress, whose creed is we can change the world. And so here it's modern. There's a sense of faith in science and research and building institutions and discovery. And we can think here this quadrant is like prominent in places like Silicon Valley and the tech boom, artificial intelligence. The high priest here is like Steve Jobs and Bill Gates, right? The worship leader in this quadrant is probably like Bono, right? Like kind of rallying the masses to, unite and kind of we can change the world. We could see apologists in this quadrant as being folks like Steven Pinker or Sam Harris, who, for those who are familiar, they're kind of leading voices looking at how our civilization has dramatically changed the world for the better through science and technology and reason and these things. The temple for this religion you can think of as being perhaps the university, right? And particularly the STEM department, so like science, technology, engineering, mathematics. Like it's through studying in those fields that you can ascend the ranks of the new priesthood and mediate the transcendent truths of this quadrant to the world, right? So we've got all of that, and I think of the iPhone as well. Like the zealous devotees in this quadrant. You can find them standing for hours, 8 hours in line at the Apple store or whatever for the newest relic, the amulet. The amulet of this religion, which I have right here. Which gives you access to omniscience, being able to know everything, seeking to know everything that's happening in the world, to omnipresence, being able to be present to friends and family through FaceTime or whatever around the world, to omnipotence, the power of the universe, like in the palm of your hand, right? But so the religion of progress. If we move over to the upper right quadrant, so the modern right, this is what I call the religion of responsibility. So here the creed is pull yourself up by your bootstraps. And so in the modern right, there's a strong faith in things like hard work and taking personal responsibility for yourself, for your family, for those closest to you. We think of the high priest, or when you think of this quadrant, we see this ideology is made more prominent in the suburbs or on Wall Street. And the high priest here would be like Ronald Reagan, or when I was growing up, like the Public Herald would be Newt Gingrich, and the economic apologist would be Milton Friedman. But today I'd suggest the baton of leadership has been passed to figures like Jordan Peterson, where it's like, dude, if you want to change your world, you start by making your bed. Like take ownership for yourself, responsibility for yourself and those closest to you. You've got leaders like Ben Shapiro kind of exhorting his congregation of the zealous faithful every week. You've got figures like Jocko Willink or David Goggins, if you're familiar with them, who are like all about like extreme ownership, like take responsibility, take ownership for yourself and your stuff and your quadrant. And here, the temple would be maybe the house with the white picket fence, with the 2-car garage. And this is sort of the reward for the faithful for their service, for taking responsibility. Here's kind of the just recompense and reward for their faithful service and all. And I should say too, when I'm talking about these quadrants, I'm being descriptive, not prescriptive here, right? So I get in the book later to try and prescribe what does people look like. But here we're not trying to critique, and especially I get to the next 2 quadrants, like the goal is not to critique so much, it's just to give us a lay of the land, to try and describe some of the forces that are tugging at our affections. All right, so when I was growing up, that progress, responsibility, that felt like kind of the lay of the land, right? But I'd say increasingly we now move to the lower quadrants, which have moved from modernity increasingly more to postmodernity, being impacted by that. So really quick, what do I mean by modernity and postmodernity? Well, as Jim and I shared with us, like all the philosophy majors are going to want to slap me right now for how simplistic I'm about to be. But in sum, talk about modernity, think a visual stereotype of like a scientist in a lab coat who's researching and dissecting the world. Modernity, there was a high belief in like reason and science and institutions and so on. But when we moved to postmodernity, this grew out of a reactionary movement towards modernity, which became disillusioned with many of the failures of modernity. We've got world wars. We've got things like eugenics done in the name of science. We've got the potential of nuclear war out of, these things that have come out. And so there was this reaction where the visual stereotype here might be like the artist painting a picture of themselves as the artist, where now there's a sense of, I don't know if the modernity was about dissecting and kind of discovering the world, postmodernity is about more self-expression and looking within and expressing oneself. So when we go to the lower left, so we'll call this the religion of identity, right? And here the creed is you do you, like live your truth, right? And so this quadrant, we could see, the ideology, there's a sense of you do you, don't let anyone tell you how to live your life, like express yourself. This ideology would be most prominent in the urban core. And so we can think of leading figures like Ta-Nehisi Coates or Jazz Jennings, the race and gender yard signs all around my house in Portland here, right? Like TikTok and Instagram, where there's a strong ethos of self-expression. Places like Boston and San Francisco, and the worship leaders in this quadrant and preachers really would be pop icons like Lady Gaga or Lil Nas X, who are modeling the way of salvation through performative self-expression and continual reinvention of themselves, right? And when we think of like the catechism of this quadrant, we think of the Disney script, right? Which I love Disney movies. I watch them with my kids, but there's increasingly like still, there's often these common themes of like, dude, your family and tradition and history, these are all obstacles to your true identity.
Why do the parents always die?
Yeah, well, the parents always die, or they're this obstacle you overcome. And so you've got to like look within and find yourself and let it go, let all those other things go and express I am Moana, and kind of find your identity and go on. And all that to say, like there's a high value on self-expression and a suspicion of anything outside of yourself that might infringe on that. We can see prophets today, political leaders like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who are focused on dismantling any structures or things in society that might hinder people from being their truest and authentic selves. I would suggest the temple of this quadrant would perhaps be the protest, right? Where this is where the vox populi, the voice of the people, gathers to register their disillusionment with the status quo, with the establishment, with things that are out there, and so on. I think you see a strong popularity in this quadrant of like personality tests, and I like the Enneagram. I'm not like going after it, I don't whatever, but I think I never get more hate mail than when I say anything less than enthusiastic about the Enneagram, but. I think the reason or the reality that it's so popular and prominent today, it's a sign of this quadrant's obsession with discovering oneself and self-discovery and stuff. I know. Okay, so there we've got the lower left, and then finally, if we move to the lower right, this one I call the religion of security. And so the religion of security, where the creed here would be good fences make good neighbors. And so here there's a sense of, man, the world is a dangerous place. We need boundaries and borders to keep people safe. There are threats and things we need to keep at bay. And so with the religion of security, we can see this more prominent in places like, think of like the heartland, and think of the heartland left behind by the coastal economic booms. We can think of Appalachia and epidemics of addiction and unemployment. We can think of Detroit and jobs shipped overseas and the decline of manufacturing and so on. I think of leaders like Tucker Carlson or Sean Hannity, as kind of high priestly type figures here. I would say the high priest in this quadrant, whether you love him or hate him, like whatever, but Donald Trump, feels like representative often of this quadrant where when we think of his most viral campaign slogans, whatever one thinks of him, they resonate with some of this theme of security and all themes of this quadrant, where themes like drain the swamp speaks to a suspicion of elites and all. Make America Great Again speaks to a patriotic nationalism in the face of globalization and so on.
Build a wall.
Yeah, speaks to a desire for security and borders in the context of immigration and all. And, and I think what makes this quadrant postmodern, again, it's a deep suspicion of like the institutions and all of modernity. So there's the rhetoric you'll often hear of like, man, the deep state government wants to take away your rights. Like big pharma is pushing its meds, its pills, its vaccines on you. The fake news, wants to deceive you. The elites are out to get you. You need to stand strong against those things. And what's interesting in these lower quadrants, I think the lower left quadrant still wants progress, but it no longer trusts those institutions to get it there. So now the vehicle for progress is no longer out there. It's look within, and looking within is how we're going to get progress, letting everyone be their most authentic selves. The lower right still wants responsibility, but it's no longer a responsibility to like a moral order or norm kind of out there as a whole. Now it's a responsibility more of a loyalty to one's in-group, their closest kind of tribe and relationships. And I'm sorry, I'm blabbing all here. I'll wrap this up in a second. But
this is the pastor, teacher, author here.
Yeah, exactly.
The lowdown.
But the loyalty theme. I had a buddy of mine who grew up in 90s hip hop culture, and he was kind of like, man, it's interesting how a lot of the themes in this quadrant resonate a lot with those themes I heard growing up with, say, like gang culture. The rhetoric was a lot of the same of like, man, the streets are dangerous, the police are out to get you, your safety's at stake, and so we need to show loyalty to those closest to us, to our in-group, and the highest crimes or, things are being like a narc or a snitch or a traitor. And it's like, dude, you see a lot of that same mentality in, at times, kind of the lower right quadrant. So, okay. And if we were to say the temple of this quadrant, I would suggest is the nation itself. There's a sense of there are heretics within who need to be shamed and called back to the ancient paths. There are corrupt priests above who they're defiling the sanctuary in DC and they need to be kicked out of power. There are hostile invaders at the gate who need to be repelled, and this is kind of like the sacred space that needs to be protected and so on. And big picture, again, all that's just trying descriptively to mark the lay of the land. And some people might be like, hey, you're calling them religions. It's kind of cute, but is it really? But historically, the root of the word religion meant had to do with devotion, like devotion to some greater good and the social bonds and expectations that came with that devotion. And I'd suggest there's no greater devotion and zeal that many people are showing today than to their political ideology and to whatever particular quadrant they're in. And so the question becomes, where do we go from here? We can talk about that, but the tagline, the theme in this section is bring your lean, but submit your bow. Of going, we all have a political leaning, and that's okay. We all probably lean towards one of those quadrants. I know I do, and many people I know do. We lean to a different quadrant, and that's okay, actually. Each of those quadrants is based off of a good value. I would argue that progress, responsibility, identity, security, we see all those values in the Garden of Eden, in the biblical story. So we can bring our political leaning, and there's a perspective that people in each of those quadrants have to bring that's healthy to a kingdom ethic, but submit your bow, meaning that submitting our ultimate allegiance to King Jesus, because when any of those four values get uprooted from God's creational design and made ultimate, they can become an idol, and those ideologies can unleash destruction in our lives and in our world. And so I look in the book at some of the ways that those can become dangerous and are confronted by the gospel. And I think what we see now is that those ideological camps and quadrants are fracturing and tearing apart the church, and that's a sign of, I think, the idolatry that has infected not only our society, but has infected the church, and that I believe we're being called back as the church to a deeper allegiance to Jesus that can hold the unity of the church together in the midst of those competing tribal divisions.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, I'm, for one, relieved to hear that you weren't suggesting a fifth option
I was waiting for it.
We all have to
Here's the right
merge
one.
into some combination of all four. That would be hard. But very good. Well, that was helpful just to kind of think about. And I think we could all kind of look back at the last few years and just go, oh, yeah, this is making a lot of sense as to what the lay of the land actually is. And I think one of the things that, I'm a pastor in the area. You're a pastor in the area. You chose a great year to come back to Portland, right? With just not going to be any kind of arguments or anything like that here this year. Election year, lots of potential for, misunderstandings, division. Who knows? What do you think, or what are you doing as a pastor to prep your congregation for some of what might be coming even later this year?
Yeah, no, great question. Well, there are a number of things. Maybe so there's a number of things that we're running after, but one of them is trying to look at. Maybe I'll share some stories of things that we used in the last season that we're looking at reusing this season, because I can share retrospectively some of the impact. So again, we didn't do everything perfectly, but a few things that were really helpful. One was we created what we called the 10 political commandments, right? Kind of jokingly, because we didn't want them to be confused with the actual 10 commandments that God gives Moses on Mount Sinai, But these, we call it a Christian political commitment. And these 10 commandments were not about how to vote, not about what opinions to hold, but rather about how to hold them well. And the reality, though, is these are things God commands us in Scripture, So if anyone wants, you can find these online at my website. There's a free download of them, and they're in the book. But, the first two, for example, the first one was worship. And I'm going off memory here, but, I commit my worship, my ultimate allegiance to King Jesus over all idols and ideologies. And I unpack that in the book more, but just going dude, I think that's the foundation, worship is a political act. We might think of that way, but it's going, man, we're exalting and ordering our lives around God as King and His kingdom as our highest authority, and our ultimate allegiance is to Him. And as an example, if we look back at those 4 quadrants I just mentioned, you could ask, well, which quadrant is Jesus in? Which of those values does He belong to? And the reality is Jesus doesn't belong to those values belong to Him, And when we rightly order Jesus as King of Kings and Lord of Lords, it helps us frame those values in their proper place. And I share stories of being in Vietnam with the persecuted church and seeing how their allegiance to King Jesus, for them, they were being thrown in jail and enduring blatant persecution for their allegiance to King Jesus in the midst of a hostile political environment. Yeah. But when I asked them why, I remember they would say, don't pray that persecution ends, pray that Jesus would be glorified. It's they had a commitment, an ultimate allegiance to King Jesus that enabled faithfulness in much darker, starker political times. So worship starts with worship. The second one is love of neighbor. I commit to my civic engagement being involved, being motivated and driven by a love of neighbor rather than just self-interest and whatnot. And going, whatever political policies or different things we may land on, there's debate and opinion in terms of how that fleshes itself out in terms of policies and voting, whatever. But in terms of motive, I believe that that's non-negotiable. Jesus calls the greatest commandments, love God and love neighbor, that should be at the heart of our ethic. And if we're moving into a place of hostility and hatred for, the enemy, we're turning people enemies, then that's a sign that there's something off in our posture and approach. And so then there's 8 other ones, that get into themes like biblical wisdom and fruitful speech and love of enemies and biblical justice, themes of that nature. So that was one practical thing.
Yeah.
And what we found, we invited our church to go, hey, we're inviting and even calling you to sign on to this. And we had, I think it was around 500 people sign on to it.
Nice.
And a lot of the language that came out of it, though, was people saying this was so helpful because it felt like it gave clarity and guidelines on just clarity on like what it is expected of me as a follower of Jesus in this season, And I think it changed some of the posture and tone on that front. Another thing that we did was we started, we called them prayer and action groups, but it was basically a challenge to folks going, especially for those of you who are getting really excited about, active online, you take some of that energy and pour it into our local community, like actually getting involved here in our city, right? And so the prayer and action groups were, because often prayer and action get separated. Like some folks, we'll just pray about it, but you don't actually pray. And some folks like, we're going to go change the world, but they get burnt out and whatever. Okay, the commitment was you're signing up for 1 year commitment to meet regularly with a group, about 12 to 15 people. And you're going to read some of the first two we started. One was on sanctity of life, and another one was on criminal justice, knowing that those represented issues very important to each side of the, typical, maybe political divide. And I'm going to commit to meeting weekly with this group. We're going to read some of the best resources out there on it. We're going to meet with local leaders who are working in this arena, and we're going to look for and commit to, and we're going to pray, and we're going to look and commit to one constructive piece of action that we can help lead our church in making a difference in our city. And just making it concrete. And what was crazy was both those groups ended up coming back and going, oh my gosh, the things that actually would make the biggest difference that they took on in our city were different than what they initially thought going into it, And so I think just moving away from the echo chambers and shouting into the void online to actually like, how can we be the church right here where God's placed us in our city in powerful ways? Maybe a final thing, I actually go into a lot of ideas in the book, but another one was by the time we got to October, we called our people to a 40-day social media fast prior to the election.
Whoa. But where are you going to get your news from, Josh?
Yeah, exactly.
How are you going to know about your,
No, that's bold, man. That's bold.
Yeah.
Your uncle's new girlfriend or what? Like, you got to keep up with the Joneses.
Yes. Well, and the idea behind it, too, is going, part of this was getting ahead, of even like prepping these things earlier in the year. And so by the time we got to there, we were like, the reality is by the time we hit October, everybody's mind's made up. You're not changing anybody's mind online. You're just arguing, getting divides. So what if we took that time instead to even to fast, to pray, and to pray for our country, pray for our leaders, pray for around us, and to seek face-to-face conversations, even with those that we might lean different directions from and all, and build up our community that way. And the critique from a few people, people loved it. Loads of people did it. And a lot of people didn't get back on social media afterwards. They're like, this is actually, I feel way more peaceful and mental clarity and alive and doing better stuff in my community, whatever. But one of the critiques, that came up was, well, it feels like we're checking out of the real world. But I would suggest, like, social media is not the real world. Like it has a place. I'm online. I'm on social media.
Can you add cable news to that fast too?
Yes, totally. It's not. Yes. Well, but here's the thing: is going like, dude, it's not the real world. Meaning, like, dude, there are algorithms and people spending billions of dollars to captivate your allegiance and to pull you in different tribal loyalties, and it's not reality. And so I'm not saying that we shouldn't be online. Like I'm online. I'm great being online. But I think doing something like a social media fast at times, it's not checking out of reality. It's a way to check back into reality, like the real world of real relationships, real people, real conversations, and so on. And so those are some of the ideas to get into of just ways.
Really good.
Yeah.
Love that.
Practical.
Yeah, that is super helpful.
Okay, I have one more question, and that is, as a local church pastor, and one of the things that it feels like there's always this awareness of the agenda wars that are happening in people's minds for anybody or anything that is a platform or that has a voice of influence, including a pastor, right? So somebody always has a plan for your message, for your preaching. And I think we have to figure out, how do we balance this? So what advice would you give, like, in terms of how do we keep the gospel central to the communication coming forth in our churches? How do we keep from being pulled aside over some line? I mean, because there is a responsibility. I hear you saying and teaching, there's a discipleship here about how to interact with people that you're different from. But also, where do you draw the line? Where should we think about drawing the line on keeping the gospel central?
And there's that draw, like, are you going to talk about this issue?
Yeah.
You got to speak to this.
Yeah.
Are you not going to mention it?
Right.
Yeah.
And you're going to get those notes, right?
Oh, totally. Yeah. And I think, man, as a pastor, feeling that pressure and tension at times, like, are we going to say anything? Like, there's the newest, one chapter, I call it the new national liturgy of the crisis of the week. Like, there's the crisis of the week, and there's this pressure, like, is my pastor going to say anything? Are we going to address it? And even having leadership conversations, are we going to address it? Well, a few thoughts on that. I share, I think, more detailed thoughts in the week, but one of the things that I talk about is one piece is trying to reframe and broaden even what we mean by political, because I would suggest, like, I believe that the gospel itself is inherently political, but in a different way than we or our people often tend to think, right? The gospel is the good news that Jesus is King. He is Lord. He is Savior and Lord. God is reconciling all creation through him. And that's a public statement. That's a political claim to who is the rightful ruler of the world. And I was just, our church gatherings on Sunday are actually already political in ways that we might not recognize. So I talk about a lot of typical elements of a typical service being political in ways we might not recognize. So the call to worship, for example, when we gather on a Sunday, we have to start with the call to worship. And that's not like, hey, everybody worship. It's properly understood. It's pulling back the curtain, so to speak, to draw our attention to, here's who our God is. Like, God is, we could focus on so many things. He's our Father, he's our King, he's our Savior, he's the resurrection of the life, he's the living water. He's, when we do that, though, when we gather and we center and order our attention on who God is and who he's revealed himself to be through the gospel, and we're ordering our lives around him, that is actually designed to politically form us, in a sense. And it's designed to form us around to an allegiance to God first, before CNN or Fox News, before the opinions of the echo chamber I'm swirling around. It's reordering our focus and our attention and our worship around God and our devotion to him above all other allegiances. So that, I talk about the confession. We have had a regular spot of confession in our services, and some of the ways that we've utilized that or focused that. One is a confession of sin. And so sometimes, that'll be like a confession of things that we've, omission and commission, things that we've done and left undone. And I believe that's designed to form in us a posture of humility, which is actually a part of our political formation. Like, how much do we need right now a posture of humility in our public discourse? That actually, if we actually allowed the rhythms of confession to shape us, then it would, I believe, form us to be more self-critical, looking at the logs in our own eye and in our own camp's eye, rather than just seeking to poke the eyes out of our opponents. Another arena we sometimes use that for is confessing our brokenness and lament at some of the brokenness in the world. And so often when there is a national tragedy, let's say, we'll utilize that spot in the service to maybe have a prayer of lament read aloud in relation to the latest school shooting or the latest crisis that's become exposed. Being able to not, and we work intentionally to make those not what I say, like priestly, not pundit. That they're not attempting to kind of give some veiled diatribe, but rather to bring our collective pain before God. And then looking at the sermon or communion, the Eucharist, when these are rhythms where we are ordering our lives around God's redemptive words spoken into our midst, around Jesus' presence given to us sacramentally as his people to unite us to himself and to one another. And in short, to go, they aren't political in the ways that we think of, like Democrat, Republican, but they are designed to form us as the public people of God in a particular way that should shape how we then enter into public space in our broader society.
Yeah, man.
Yeah,
I appreciate that.
That's powerful. That section on liturgy was really timely. I feel like, and is often overlooked in these kind of topics. So maybe one last thing that we can touch on while we have you here. So as I was reading your book, I had in the back of my mind an event that the three of us were at just last week.
Yes.
And so we hosted together. PDX brought in Russell Moore from Christianity Today and Sheree Harder from Trinity Forum, right? And so they just kind of had an open discussion time. They gave 2 short presentations and talked about this question of like living in this fractured time, right? This issue of politics and Christian faithfulness. And Russell Moore touched a little bit on this curriculum they created with David French and another gentleman called the After Party, right? And so I went in, just truth be told, into your book, kind of having that in the back of my mind and wondering, okay, is this similar? Is this different? Are we going to get what is this Christian view of political engagement, right? And since I'm not currently a pastor, I can be a little more like, I'm not going to get any emails about this probably, but like I can show my political cards a little bit. And so, like, truth be told, I'm sitting in this Russell Moore event, and I'm familiar with his kind of things he said over the years. I'm familiar with David French and kind of some of the stances he's taken, and they've been public about it. But I felt like they're emphasizing that the issue for Christian political engagement is stop being extreme, be moderate, stop being mean, and be kind, right? Don't use worldly means to accomplish kingdom ends, right? So I agree. It's hard to disagree with any of that. But then personally, I felt like, I don't want to say attacked. I felt not honored from my leaning. So I'm more on the postmodern side, and I kind of go back and forth. Part of me, I have one foot in the security conservative postmodern side, and one foot in a little bit more of the identity kind of social justice structure side. Like, honestly, that's just historically, that's where I feel more identified with. I've never been excited about a big party candidate in my entire life. Right, I've always rooted for someone else that never won the primary, or an independent. I've never been a party guy, but one of the things, a phrase they used several times, was conspiracy theory. And then I listened to another kind of talk that Russ Moore and David French gave about the after party, and they threw it out probably almost a half a dozen times, was conspiracy theory, and they seem to be saying, hey, there's these radically minded people, and I think we could agree the conspiracy theory, most of them fall within this bottom right quadrant of the conservative postmodern, anti-elite kind of thing. You've quoted some of that, and so I identify in certain ways with that group, and identify with like distrusting certain institutions and certain things I'm told by authorities, and so in this kind of saying, hey, we all need to be moderate, and we all need to find kind of this third way where we're not caught up in political parties, but actually we just need to be old school blue dog Democrats. It's kind of, from my perspective, what I hear them saying. And then rather than actually engaging with nuanced conversations about where have certain institutions failed us, where have certain mainline kind of ideas shown to be not true, and let's sit around the table and talk. I felt like, well, okay, they're kind of lobbing some grenades, and there's a caricaturing of at least one of these four leanings, and trying to call Christians back from that, right? It's all these Trump-loving kind of conspiracy theory nut jobs. Let's call them back to something far more moderate. And for me, I would rather have godly representatives from each of these four quadrants sit down at a table and talk honestly, instead of like pretending we don't have political leanings. Because I know Russ Moore and David French fit within one of those leanings. And that's great, and that's fine. But let's not act like there's this holier than like fifth way where we're all just really nice to each other and can kind of decide on a moderate candidate. Like I wish we can kind of come from our leanings and hold the Bible as central and talk about our genuine disagreements, but not use kind of caricatures, whether it's that, well, he's a woke CRT, like social justice warrior, or yeah, he's the conspiracy theory, MAGA, like racist, whatever, homophobe. I'm like, well, no, like let's just actually like engage with each other as humans. And like, so I felt as maybe even the minority in the room, like, wow, I feel like you're not using gospel means when you describe some of the ideas I relate to. And so I don't want to fall into that, but I felt like, okay, let's sit at the table and let's love each other and not pretend we don't have leanings. So that's some of what I was feeling. I don't know if I was alone, but when I read your book, I felt like you were doing something different. I felt like there wasn't a veiled, this is actually the way of Jesus, and it actually looks like this. Whether it's a Tucker Carlson version of the book or of politics, or a far more liberal kind of version, it was just, no, here are all the leanings. There's some strengths and weaknesses. There's some perspectives that we're not going to agree on, but Jesus is like, he's a part of it, but he's different. So that's what I appreciated. And so I guess it's not even a question, but it's just saying I felt genuinely helped by that perspective. And I feel like it helped me understand myself and then also understand some of my brothers and sisters that are different and coming from different backgrounds.
Wow. Thank you. Yeah. A few thoughts. One is, I'd say big picture. I love Russell Moore, David French. I've learned a ton from them over the years. And I think there's a complexity of tension, being a national figure on a national scene where I think that they're coming out of more of the conservative world, like the South, the conservative world. And so it seems like they're speaking to the idols in their camp, so to speak,
Yep.
At least the tradition they've come out of. But it pose a challenge, I wonder, sometimes where it's like, okay, then you're in an environment like Portland, and
Yes.
I kind of go,
we have different idols in our camp.
We're not the Bible Belt. Like we got some different idols. So there is a tension there where they're navigating, like having this national voice, but there's unique context that we're all in. But a few thoughts on that. I do think that on the bigger thread of what you're hitting, I do think there's a danger that one of the things I call it in the book is fake boldness. Jim and I use this phrase because we saw this happen a lot in Phoenix, where depending on what part of town you were in, there were different idols in different camps. Like we were in I don't need to go on all the, like demographics of where you were at, different parts of town. But what I noticed was like churches would get really bold about the idol across town, And so if you were in like the urban core and you had the young demographic who leaned left, then they would just spend all the time lambasting Christian nationalism and which there's no Christian nationalism, in their church. No one who would say that. And then if you were more the suburban, affluent, kind of older, whatever, then it was all about CRT and the woke, whatever. Like that was everything. But they've got no one in their church who would identify with any of those things. But there was a sense of like they were being bold, and like, oh, we're the CRT and the Christian National, like there would just be like this big. emphasis there. But we call it fake boldness because it's like you're being bold about an idol across town, but you're ignoring the one that's in your own camp, you know? And I think that's a danger right now is it's really easy as churches as leaders to kind of to plant a flag in a sense in a quadrant and to get really bold about stuff that's happening elsewhere, but you're kind of mobilizing and rallying people on your own, but to not address the idols in our own camp, you know? And to your point too, you know, I think that we can often caricature the perspective of folks that are not in maybe the demographic that we're ministering to. So, I mean, just to give an example, you know, here in Portland, you hear a lot about anti-Christian nationalism, right? And I wouldn't say, hey, I'm a Christian nationalist, but trying to identify some of the I think one of the complexities is how we define terms and what they mean. Because some of terms like Christian nationalism, CRT, are used really broadly and ambiguously. And it's helpful for me to kind of try and ask, well, what do you mean by the term and define it? Because, you know, when I was in Arizona and Iraq, you know, like, fine, okay, for some people, that term, you know, nationalism means globalization right now is happening and all of our wealth is getting sucked out and it's making the elites on the coast really wealthy and it's disempowering the poor in our country. And so it's actually a concern for class and for poverty and for the poor, you know, like standing up for the poor in the midst of the dangers of globalization and the uber rich, you know, like for others, there's a sense of going, dude, I want to prioritize like the well-being of our nation in the midst of a lot of competing forces. For some others, you've got like maybe on an extreme, there are some who are going, I want to make this a theocracy or whatever, you know, and there's this way, like, I don't know many of them in Portland, but I know there's some in the nation, you know, like, and then for others, I've had a mind blank right now, but going like, I've heard like 4 different definitions to who you're talking to. And for some, it's like just something that's easily used to shut down. You want to, your vision of morality, you think that life in the womb is a child and is sacred and should be protected. Stop imposing your Christian morality on it. But you could flip it back and go, well, you want to impose your morality on it's just a progressive leftish morality on it. So, you know,
there was this CNN clip that went around on social media where it was a gal being interviewed and she says, oh yeah, these Christian nationalists, they believe that our rights come from God and not from the state.
Then sign me up. I'm a Christian nationalist. You know,
wow.
Totally.
Yeah. And it's like, read your history books. Actually, the founders believed that too.
Yes, totally. Yes, totally. And the history of the idea of human rights comes from Christianity. So all that to say, you know, the big picture being like there are these terms that are thrown around that can mean multiple different things depending on who you're talking to. And I think it's helpful to your point of going, it's easy to throw around the label that's going to rile up people in our crowd and often relies on kind of a caricature of someone on the other side. And I think it's helpful for us and for as churches, for our, you know, as Christians to be wary of reading into things, right? So I talk about a few stories in the book, some funny ones, but one was we had this person at our church who was kind of new visitor and they were like, why do you guys have these All Lives Matter signs all over your building? And I was like, what? All Lives Matter sign? We don't, they're like, no, you got these All Lives Matter billboards plastered all over your campus. And I'm like, what? And I'm thinking like, hey, did we get like graffitied or tagged or what is going on here? And they're like, no, you guys got these. And so we're like, can you show us these signs? They take us around and our vision statement, our motto for over a decade it was all over the campus. It was, all of life is all for Jesus. You're like, dude, all of life is all for Jesus. And they were seeing that and going, all lives matter. You guys are like, all lives matter. And it's like, dude, stop reading into stuff, you know, like, and that's like an extreme humorous example, but like, I think that's often what's going on. Like, there are so many people who are like on the lookout. We're suspicious, we're highly cynical, and we're reading it. The pastor said this, and he must mean this, you know? Like, there was a sermon that a friend of mine was giving where at our church and a church in our network, and he was talking about progressive sanctification a few times, and the idea that like, okay, you don't become holy overnight; it's a gradual process over time. It's progressive, and he had this woman, just livid, elderly woman, kind of angry after the service, going, "Why are you saying that if I'm becoming sanctified, I'm going to be becoming more progressive?" And he's like, dude, that is not what I'm saying. And he had 2 emails in his inbox the next day. Same thing. I can't believe you said, And so just recognizing, man, we're going to be in this spot this election season, where I think people's suspicion is up, radar is up. And I think part of Christ-like maturity and humility is like, take a deep breath. Don't assume the word. Let's assume the best of each other. Let's ask questions rather than accusations. Like if there's a concern. One other thing we did at our church in the last season was we created an online calendar with 15-minute appointment slots, and it was call us and ask a question. Any question. Like if something got you're confused, what'd you mean by that, or understand it, whatever. Like, and honestly, not that many people called, but I think even just knowing that was the posture, we want to hear from you if you have concerns.
I love that.
And I found so many times when people were upset, I think people just want to be heard right now, and like, and how often when someone's railing, an email or whatever, just let's hop on the phone and spending 15 minutes to listen to the thing, go, oh, I hear you. Yeah, that's not what I meant. I meant this. I'm sorry to hear you. Asking good questions. I found once people feel heard, like it just tends to de-escalate. A ton, and you're no longer then dealing with a caricature, a misunderstanding, a misperception. You can kind of get to the heart of the issue, and more constructive.
This has been good.
So good.
This is good.
Yeah. Thank you, Josh.
Thanks, you guys.
Yeah.
Appreciate you. 3 quick things.
Yes.
1, everybody should get your book and read it, right? The Party Crasher.
If they want.
Second thing, how can people get in touch with you if they want to?
Great. Yeah, totally. So website, joshuaryanbutler.com out there.
Okay.
I'm on primarily on Instagram most often, and so it's just at Joshua Butler PDX.
Great.
And I'm at Willamette Christian Church, a pastor at the Willamette family of churches here in the Portland metro area. And so people can find me online there at our website and stuff too.
Great. And then third thing is Josh is coming to speak with a bunch of church planting folks and multiplication-minded folks at an event on May 17th. And so we're looking forward to seeing you there. If anybody listening wants to get more information about that, you can just go to @multiplypdx on Instagram and get the info there. So
looking forward
to that.
Yeah,
thanks, Josh. Thanks so much for joining us for this episode of Jesus in the Upper Left. We want to ask you a quick favor. Would you please subscribe so you don't miss a single episode, and share with those that are in your life that might benefit from the content. Hit the notifications button, rate and review, of course, and then head on over to upperleftshow.com where you can find bonus content, opportunities to connect with those around the city that are doing similar work as you, resources to help you, and just a way to connect to the community. We hope to see you again next time.